Okay, time for our 1 o'clock show. Good afternoon. I'm Jay Fidell. Welcome back to ThinkTech. Today's show is part of our Global Connections series, and we'll be discussing why do Central Americans emigrate with Carlos Juarez, who is our co-host and contributor for this show. Welcome to the show, Carlos. Nice to see you.
Great to see you, Jay. Always a pleasure. And obviously, we continue our dialogue. We've had past opportunities to talk a bit about the so-called migration crisis. I guess now there's even debate, is it a crisis or not? And I think it's important because it is certainly in the headlines and it's, a political hot potato. It's certainly going to be on the agenda, immigration reform, et cetera. But I want to say, the teacher in me, the scholar in me wants to make sure that we understand this is not a simple story and it's not something that's happening right now suddenly out of nowhere. There's a larger historical context. There's a longer track record. And, when we speak about Central America, again, really, we have to look back at the political upheaval that took place in the 1970s and 80s in this region. And some of it is domestic, challenges that they faced, internal, fights over resources, power, all that. But some of it is also international. As you recall, Central America became a hotspot for the Cold War and the violence that erupted there. And the United States very directly involved in sometimes underhandedly in different countries. But I guess what I want to say too is that we have to step back to understand each of these individual countries. We're talking about Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in particular. They comprise now, we often refer to them as the Northern Triangle, this region of Central America. But essentially, in the last decades of the 20th century, they had a devastating crisis with a human toll that was dramatic. 250,000 people died during the period from about 74 to 96, so a little over 20 years. 250,000 people were killed, and over 1 million.
How is that? That's murder? Military murder?
The largest number in Guatemala, and a lot of that was state-sponsored terrorism. Yes, actual military carrying out, death squads, and it's hard to measure it, but we know the numbers are astonishing. And then you had, again, complex conflicts in each one, slightly different. In Nicaragua, obviously, what we had there was a revolutionary movement. Remember, that overthrew basically a classic dictator, and then the U.S. funding a counter-revolutionary movement, the infamous Contras. Well, that's a different story. You turn then to El Salvador, the other country there, and you've got a civil war, a conflict that flares up between, sort of fratricidal, between conflicts. But of course, the challenge for us is that the United States is involved in all these in very direct ways. And we had, again, these are among the poorest countries, certainly in the hemisphere. Today, their GDP per capita is barely $4,000 a person. And you add to that they are now besieged with a level of criminal violence we haven't seen in anywhere, in the highest in the world. But maybe I just want to put it in this context. Is it a crisis today? Well, this has been going on for quite a while. It's not entirely new. It's happened in different waves, and it's a result of a combination of many different factors that I want to kind of try to unravel. Beyond that, let me just say that, I think a lot of the key features of what we're seeing, why there is such a problem, why are people emigrating, really stems from the transitions that these countries did after the violence of the 70s and 80s. In one after another, they had transitions that took place, and they were marked by peace processes. You had a peace settlement in Guatemala, you had another peace accord in El Salvador, and they made promises to obviously transition, to end the bloody internal conflicts, and to set a course for democratization. I mean, it all sounds good and fine. Of course, it didn't go well in the end, but I think we want to be careful not to somehow both make this problem so simplified, like somehow it's new or it's all the same. And moreover, even as we look at the type of refugees that are showing up, there are different ones. And right now, today, we see the story of the unaccompanied minors, the children. It's dramatic. It's a human rights, and humanitarian issue. But let me say that there are larger numbers of immigrants who are trying to come over that are not being allowed in, that are essentially being stopped and turned away, let's say. It's hard to get all of that accurate in the media, let's say, because the sensational part is to go and look at a facility that's obviously overwhelmed. There's no question that today there is a capacity problem for the administration. They've had overwhelming waves of people coming in these last days.
I would be certain that Ted Cruz's trip to the border today is going to result in criticism of the Biden administration in every which way. There's nothing that he's going to find that will be positive because he is using the trip as a weapon against the Biden administration and to enhance his own prospects in politics. But let me go back to another issue, and you touched on it.
Mhm. Yeah.
As you know, from 1823 forward, we've had the Monroe Doctrine. And that was a good idea at the time. I think it was good to keep strangers out of the Americas. When you make a doctrine like that, you're at least implying that you will take care of your friends in the Americas, and that justifies keeping strangers out of the Americas. You can't just say strangers keep out and we'll let the whole place go to seed, which is pretty much what the United States has done since 1823, and increasingly so. Political manipulation and intelligence maneuvers that were of questionable value and methodology. And we haven't helped those countries. We haven't provided them the tools, the resources, the support they might have needed to become democracies really close to our southern border. So, I for one, my own feeling is that we have failed in dealing with Mexico and south of Mexico. I mean, I don't think it's impossible to recover from that. I think with a significant initiative, an administration in the United States could improve that. But you're right in the sense that we have violence, we have economic failure, we have political failure, we have people who are afraid for their lives every day. And there's no prospect that they will be able to, most of those countries you're talking about, no prospect they'll be able to recover on their own. They do need help. We are the natural help for them. And I think that's got to be factored into this whole discussion. If we wanted to take a long-term view and establish a border that was, what do we call it, mutually respectful, we'd have to do a lot of work south of the border to make those countries truly viable, don't you think?
Well, no, absolutely. And I think, there's no simple solution to this very, very complicated problem. You have to have a multi-pronged approach. Yes, and we're hearing now more attention to the root causes. And what are those? Well, again, in the past, it was violence of a type that was more connected to the state, basically, the governments themselves, the military institutions. And this process that I mentioned, the transition, by the 90s, we had all these countries suddenly getting away from that and establishing democratic governments. Now, weak institutions, no doubt, challenges. Moreover, they began a process of reforming some of the criminal justice systems that are very weak and difficult. Well, they're just simply not working. But effectively, what they were trying to do, these processes of democratization, was to take away the state's power to tyrannize the population. That is what had happened in the 70s and 80s. You had effectively, the state itself imposing a lot of that. And that was the hallmark of Central America throughout much of their history, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador. And so these processes that we've mentioned in the 90s that were set up, they were brokered by the United Nations, by Latin America's, sort of regional powers. They were designed to eventually open the door to development, to help them construct new societies, equity, peace, social justice, et cetera. So it's been there. But what happened? Well, again, it gets very difficult. And again, no simple explanations for any of this. A lot of it is, when you have transitions to democracy, people's expectations are that, hey, it's going to happen overnight. We're going to get, this happened in the Middle East, let's have elections after a while. Pretty soon, within a few years, most people don't see change in their lives. And there's a dissatisfaction, a frustration. The capacity of some of these countries to really be, let's say, prospering from the global economy is limited. And then you add to that socioeconomic structures that concentrate the power and the wealth, and it's a daunting challenge. Add to that things that are beyond the control, because there are certain things that are maybe man-made, the weak institutions, the corruption. But you add to that natural disasters, and this region has suffered tremendous, even in the last fall we had Honduras with more of these horrible floods and people that are simply distraught. And look, that happens anywhere in the world. Everybody comes to the help, the international community, etc. I think another thing that we want to distinguish is that there are different kind of migrants who have been coming and doing this now for decades. Some of them are the workers that are necessary for the economy. The United States depends on a flow of migrant workers. Since we don't have a coherent and, let's say, functioning policy, a good many of them are these illegal ones. But that's different from these young children that are being left at the border. And what I want to get at is that many of them actually have families and connections in the US, and they're being dropped off literally with a phone number in their pocket. Call your, brother or your uncle or your grandparent in X or Y place.
But what happens? What's the scenario? So
Well,
I'm in Nicaragua. I have a child. I'm worried about the child. The child has no future in Nicaragua. My family has none either, but I want him to have a good life. So I say, go to the United States. How does he get across the border? What happens when he reaches the border? Why doesn't the United States just say, no, you can't come here. You can't cross the border. We're going to turn you back. Why are there hundreds, even thousands of minors now in these detention facilities? You would have thought we learned enough, during the Trump administration to avoid having loose children all over the place.
yeah. Let me suggest this, that this is not new. It's been going on for some time. It has now come back again. And obviously the pandemic put it on hold for a year. You'll recall 2 years ago, we had other waves of caravans. I mean, again, there's no simple, quick explanation. Many of these that are coming, the unaccompanied minors, are usually young males, 14 to 16, 17. They have some kind of connection. They're just not showing up out of the blue. Now, of course, they're coming from an environment where there are, criminal organizations that are now running the country. Effectively, the state itself is not in full control. You've got networks of criminal organizations, many of them which came from the US. They were deported Central Americans that we emptied out our prisons, back in the early 2000s and the 90s. And it happens that when you send, the worst away, guess what? They are the ones who now control the security environment, which is different. So remember the early days, you had revolutionary movement, civil war. Now you have criminal gangs that literally are threatening people's and obviously looking for recruits. So these young kids are fleeing that. And when they have a family member or somebody they can be connected with, that's the ideal solution. And so you put them in a temporary status, you get them out of the Customs and Border Enforcement and put them into the Health and Human Services folks to connect them with family. This is obviously the challenge right now because the infrastructure was basically dismantled and we didn't have that capacity.
It's a question of money, though. If I gave you a few $100 million, you could build an infrastructure that would handle everybody. The question, though, is, do they have a right to come into the U.S.? I mean, what is their legal status? And why are they here?
Yeah, well, they're here to try to be reconnected with family in many cases.
Why are they here legally?
When they are unaccompanied minors that have a family resident who is here legally, has a status, they can be reunited in effect, especially as minors. Again, there's a different status for that. And it's ultimately, and let me say this, one of the things we can say about the last several administrations, including Trump, Obama, is that the policy hasn't really changed a lot, even though that may sound strange to say that. But of course, we hear, for example, it was under Obama that the largest number of deportations occurred. The difference, I would say, is more in the rhetoric and what it is the leaders are saying. Obviously, with Obama and even today with the Biden, there's an effort to say, hey, no, we're going to, have a more human face to it. We're going to obviously address the more human condition. And with Trump, he was using the same powers that we had before, but his language, his narrative, of course, was very aggressive. Now, having said that, today there is a lot of concern that many of those coming from Central America are basically going on the rumor, on the assumption, on the expectation that this new sheriff in town has now got the door open. In other words, that yes, it is now easier and more likely that you can get through.
And the people
past.
trying to come in are, in Trump's characterization, a bunch of drug dealers and criminals and rapists.
Yeah,
and which was not true then.
No,
and it's certainly not true now.
It is not true now. Now there are rare exceptional ones, and of course we have to obviously screen and make sure those are not getting in. So the ones that are being right now processed and that we're seeing bursting at the seams because of capacity, these are young minors who are coming in essentially to try and reconnect with existing family members. If not, if they don't have an easy capacity, they don't have an option to just be here alone. They literally have to be reunited and connected with family.
But assuming that, why does it, Homeland Security just say, okay, you're here, you have a certain quality of, characterization of your visa, go to see your family, go now. Here's the door, go. Why don't we just do that?
Well, again, I'm not sure if I get clear what you're saying. Let a 14-year-old just go free and get him, on a bus in
Then
McAllen.
have the family come
Oh, yeah.
down to a
Well,
border town and turn them over. Why don't we
well,
just do that? Wouldn't that alleviate the problem?
well, that is the overall process and the goal. It just takes a long time. So they go from the border patrols to the health and human services, where they then try to reach out and connect. And it's a very, complicated, daunting process. And then the other is that they may be released into the custody of these family members. And then the overall idea is to have a court date that's going to determine their legal status. That can go on for months and even years. But that's the overall process again, and that's been the process for quite some time. The difference is whether we're allowing them to come in or just deporting them without giving them that access.
Seems to me that it's really just an administrative task, to set up a system to run these through. You say a court date. I'm not sure you need an immigration law judge to make a judicial determination. This is an administrative question. If he meets the standards, if he can provide sufficient proof of his family in another city, that's
Well, it is a hearing. It's not a court date. It's a hearing, basically, essentially, to do that. The problem is it doesn't happen in 48 hours. It doesn't happen in 2 weeks when you've got so many. As I recall earlier today, the president announced, I think the military, he met the leaders at the Pentagon today, and they announced, for example, today, Fort Bliss in Texas is now going to open up, 5,000 beds for this crisis. But let me say this, I want to go back to the main point, is that this has been happening. This is not the first time. We've had waves of unaccompanied minors coming for quite a long time. And it's something that we have to understand. It's a reflection of this large community that we have that resulted from many conflicts that we were directly involved with and responsible for. And even having said that, let me also add this. The large community of Central Americans in the United States, most of them have been very successful and able to integrate and assimilate and contribute, and are today just part of the society. Whether you go to Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles or New York, Salvadorans are everywhere. And their story is like any other immigrant. Yes, we've got the bad ones. We deported many of them. They are now running the criminal networks back there. And unfortunately, it's a different reality that we have to challenge now. And it's how do we interrupt and disrupt these criminal networks that are human trafficking and all kinds of every possible problem that you can imagine. This is not easy.
What I think the larger problem, at least to me, is that the Republicans are attacking Biden for everything about this program. They're blaming the whole enchilada. I mean, I use that term, the whole enchilada, on him. Where, in fact, as you say, it's been going on a while. Trump did not act to solve the problem. He'd rather put everybody in a cage. Now it seems like Biden is getting blamed for what Trump was doing or letting happen. And furthermore, Biden was deprived of a reasonable, civilized transition. So there was nothing he could have done until after the inauguration, really, to help solve this problem. And yet the Republicans, to the man, are arguing that it's all his fault and nobody should vote for him in 2024. I'm very concerned about that. It's been weaponized. Trump weaponized it during his term, and now the Trump followers are weaponizing it against Biden. This is not the way to solve the problem.
No. And unfortunately, this has been, again, the story of immigration for the story of the United States, always having a scapegoat. Today, it's a very effective tool for whipping up, the anti-immigrant sentiment, for making this very complicated problem seem very simple. What's the solution? Seal the border. That's not the solution at all. The solution is to craft some kind of a immigration policy that is rational, that makes sense, that has buy-in, that people understand. Some countries do this. We do not. The United States has a broken system. And, right now, the prospects for fixing it are not very good. We are likely to see some piecemeal reforms happen quickly. The Dreamers, the DACA recipients, probably going to see that pretty quickly. but the overall bigger picture, the status of the 11, 12 million undocumented that live in the U.S., the pathway to citizenship that's been put on the plate, I think we're going to continue to see this as a hot potato,
We're
political
going to
issue.
need legislation.
Yeah.
We have
Absolutely.
needed legislation for decades, and we haven't done it.
No.
A friend of mine was counsel for the House Immigration Committee, and he was trying to get legislation written all the time of his career. I don't think he ever actually got home on that. And so Congress has been ineffectual for a long, long time. And now we hear about, legislation that would be immigration reform, but we hear that the Republicans will never agree to that either. So it's a theoretical thing. And I wanted to ask you one question, and maybe it's in a bill which is floating around somewhere in the House on the way to the Senate. What is immigration reform? What do we hope to do with that? Because we have people who want to come into this country. They come from countries that are failures, national failures. They're always going to want to come in, and we always have a need for them. But we have to rationalize the entry path, as you say. How do we do that? What does such a bill say?
Yeah. Well, again, and when we use that term comprehensive immigration reform, it's simply a way of saying, look, this is a big, big challenging issue that has many different pieces. And it's everything, of course, for the Republicans, it tends to be the border security, something that's going to give them some sense of, we're stopping the bad hombres. But more than that, it's a simplistic view. You have so many other pieces. Again, the status of those, that are already here that aren't going to go away, because you cannot logistically round up 12 million and tell them to get in the back of the line. No, you have to look and determine, okay, you've been here 20 years, you paid your taxes, you're obviously a contributing citizen. Yes, you should have a pathway. Maybe in the next 5 to 7 years, you can become a permanent citizen or even residency if you don't have it. But, the other is what I would say fundamental is the need for some kind of rational guest worker program. I don't see this happening, but what I mean by that is obviously regularized, legalized temporary workers. Now, Canada does this quite successfully on a regular basis, even with Mexico and in particular. And at the end of the day, and I was listening to the press conference that Biden gave earlier today, and I was hearing him talk about immigration, and part of me wanted him to think, gosh, if he could just somehow right now make the case that we need immigrants. Immigrants are an integral part of who we are. He skirted around it. But the bottom line is that the United States, like other parts of the world, basically the rich countries, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Northern Europe, these are all places where we have decreasing fertility, increasing longevity. People are living longer, and by any objective measure, we are having a massive, massive demographic change that's going to have lots of problems. Every developed country like the US, we have a social security scheme that guarantees income for people in old age, right? Well, they depend on collecting contributions from the young. And when we have fewer people, where are they going to come from? We're not going to produce them here internally. There is no alternative. And that's true for Canada, for Australia, for even much of Europe, especially for Japan. And, who would have thought, 10 or 20 years ago that Japan would have been so today relatively open to bringing in temporary workers from the Philippines, from other places. You have a number of models in other countries. We'll have to save this for another talk about what I would call this need for a rational guest worker program. And in many places, it takes the form of a point system, where based on the needs of the economy, and you see this happening again, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and we'll reserve I think a future show to talk a little bit more about that.
One thing is clear, though, Carlos, it's complicated. It's human flow, and human flow is always complicated. And in order to achieve some policies and new systems, new paradigms on how to handle, immigration in general, not only from South America, from everywhere in the world, we really haven't attended to it. We would have to have a serious investigation into this, a congressional investigation by deliberative bodies in Congress who call witnesses and who formulate policies based on best practices in all of those countries you're talking about. We haven't had those hearings. We haven't had those witnesses. We've gotten into this thing about, here's the bill, pass it or don't pass it. And if you want to make an amendment, you have to struggle for that. it isn't formed up in the deliberations of our Congress. And another reason why I feel our Congress is completely dysfunctional. But don't you think that's the way to do immigration reform right now? Because we can't possibly keep track of all of these changes around the world without actually having open hearings, witnesses, testimony, all that.
Well, look, the United States and the Congress has to determine and define, the immigration policy for this country. And that's not an easy task. And it's been, given the polarization and all that, it's not in the cards. And so I think the challenge the president faces now is how much can he move forward without any support from the Republicans? Because at the end of the day, he won't be able to get everything he would like because of that. Because again, it's too easy to make it into this political hot potato. And so for the foreseeable future, my gut feeling is that we're likely to see piecemeal efforts here and there, and probably there's only so much you can do through these executive actions. You really need Congress to write new laws, new legislation, clarify it. And I just go back to this. While we have had very drastic changes in administrations, Biden, Trump, Obama, the overall policy of the U.S. remains the same, and it's not a very good working one. It's very piecemeal and dysfunctional, and it's kind of just reactionary, responding as we often have just to these momentary crises.
Isn't this racism? When I think of the Statue of Liberty and the Emma Lazarus poem written on the base, give me your tired, huddled masses. It's emotional just to say the words. Yearning to breathe free. We shoved off from that notion a long time ago. Now it's all about building walls and keeping people out and not even recognizing their value as part of the demographic. We got a serious problem, and it's not just in Congress. It's the way people see this, throughout the country, and to the extent that there's a connection between racism, and immigration. Certainly there is.
Oh, yeah.
We would have to change our view about race before we can really change our view about immigration. Don't you think?
Oh, yeah. And look, at the end of the day, I mean, a state like Hawaii, a state like California, massive immigrant populations tend to be more open-minded towards that and more accepting of it. And so at the end of it, you've got various different like regional political cultures, you might say, but you also need leadership to kind of foster that. The United States has a long history of a country of immigrants embracing. You described the famous quote there in the statue, and I'm actually this semester finishing a course where we're looking at North America, U.S., Mexico, Canada, and the integration, the growing identity, and I'm just fascinated, of course, by the story of Canada, because it really does have all that, what I want to say. And we say, oh, they're nice people, but it's more than that. They actually embrace the diversity in a very different way. And let me suggest, I don't see this happening in the US, but maybe it's happening in parts of the US. We often describe the melting pot as a concept of the US. You come here, everybody gets put into it, and we just become Americans. Canada does not embrace that. They call it the mosaic. You come here and you're from India, or you're from Vietnam, or you're from Colombia. You can keep part of that heritage, embrace it, understand what it means to live in a liberal society, respectful of others, understand your role as a citizen, contributing, and so on. But embrace this diversity, and it goes beyond that. I mean, there's literally government policies that will help, and not just government. It's not the only solution, but certainly supporting, connecting to the civil society groups, the NGOs, that essentially help immigrants integrate, because it's not enough to just let them in the door. You gotta give them a helping hand and close the deal the whole way. Again, I want to say those examples exist.
Canada for that. You got to love Canada for that.
Sure.
And Canada in the world is, as you say, it's a leader in immigration policy. It's a leader in diversity and integration of people from other places. And it is indeed a mosaic from the east to the west.
No.
And then I'd like to ask you a question that falls within the purview of other shows that we have had, you and me.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What does the world think of this? Europe has, with all its troubles, Europe has been more liberal than the United States about dealing with migrants and immigrants. We've been the hard-nosed. We've been the backward-looking. We're living sometime in the 19th century, where everybody else in the world. What do people think about what do the outsiders, people in other countries think of our immigration policy?
Look, I mean, I think it's going to be ambiguous. Some people don't know the policy or understand it, but the U.S. has always been and always will continue to be a, a place that appeals and attracts, for opportunities, for the story of so many who've come and done it. No matter where you're from, there's somebody from your community who went to America and did that, and that does continue. But having said that, obviously social media and the greater awareness, people see that it's also a society in conflict. Look, just last week, mass shootings are now the norm. We don't even think twice about it. That raises concerns, especially when we've had race and sort of targeting of foreigners in some cases. So I don't know, I guess I want to say it's ambiguous, but at the end of the day, the United States, and I see this because, as you know, I teach students in Mexico as well, in Europe on a regular basis. I mean, the United States always has a certain appeal, especially for those who are educated, open-minded, entrepreneurial, globally oriented. And it may not even be necessary because you want to go there and become American, but because guess what? If you want to study or if you want to connect with, the best communities of X or Y area, the United States remains, the sort of such a global leader in that respect. But I think people are also very aware that it has elements of racism and that it came out in the open now. And more, I hear this again, especially from my Mexican students. Canada looks more appealing. Europe looks more appealing. Australia, New Zealand looks more appealing. The United States has lost some of its shine, and it'll be some time before that should come back. I want to make clear it's going to remain a place that will continue to attract and appeal immigrants and migrants nonstop. But in effect, there is a tarnished image from the recent experience with Trump towards immigrants and maybe the face of the U.S. to the world.
So how does Joe Biden avoid being criticized, and how does Joe Biden? I mean, I would like to frame the question to include legislation he could submit, but I'm afraid I'm reluctant to suggest that because with you, I don't think that's a likely possibility. But what can he do now to make this more workable? Not that we know he's not going to be able to solve all these problems, but what can he do to take the edge off them right now?
Yeah, I mean, and let me say there are definitely legislative initiatives coming through. Even in the last days, the Senate is now discussing, some initiatives here and there. But ultimately, I think, and I think he spoke to this in his own press conference. His agenda is to solve problems. So at the end of the day, these are logistical issues. Yes, you need to get better conditions for those, and you need to not separate families, and you need to not put them in cages. Right now, he's up against the wall, and he is being criticized, rightfully so, because there's a lot of challenges and issues. Who is to blame, and is it all blaming it on the past, or have there been mistakes made right now? Is he sending mixed signals? I mean, that's a very legitimate criticism that many coming are feeling that maybe Uncle Joe has now got the door open and we can all get in. And that's not necessarily true. But good luck managing that. They are trying, and they've dispatched now some people to go down and talk with the Central American leaders to try to use social media, send signals to the population of migrants saying, wait a minute, no. But again, that's easier said than done. There's
I
no
thought he made a kind of a deal with AMLO about giving or selling 2.5 million doses of AstraZeneca to Mexico, and at the same time having AMLO help him send the message that people should not be trying to get through the border. Is that consistent with what you know?
Well, as you've just mentioned, yes, indeed, we had an announcement a week ago, Friday, that Mexico will be receiving 2.5 million, Canada 1.5 of this AstraZeneca that has not yet been approved in the U.S. and is kind of sitting in storage room. And yet, very curiously, at the same time, they say, and Mexico is going to be helping us with that southern border again, although they're not connected, but in almost in the same sentence. Very strange. But look, at the end of the day, I will say this. I mean, Biden, at least his approach signals that there's an interest in looking more at the root causes, dealing with the home countries themselves, because you cannot solve this by just creating a wall. You've got to go and figure out what's going on. It's got to be multifaceted. And what I'm getting at here is Lopez Obrador, Mexico's president, at least in principle, is also supportive of that. He came to office with the idea, we have to have a human approach. Now, Mexico has limited resources, and yet I think there's a common interest there. The U.S. and Mexico both need Central America to be better off, more prosperous, etc. So will there be more effort? I think so. Will it yield quick results? Not easily, and none of this is going to have quick answers.
What about the
But
appointment of Kamala Harris as the special czar for immigration? Is that a good choice? The Republicans are attacking that too.
well, I mean, that would be to expect it. I think, if anything, it provides at least a high profile, top advisor to the president. This is typical of vice presidents. They have no formal duties other than to break a tie or go to funerals. So you give them, you appoint them the X or Y czar. And, look, I think given her skill, maybe it's not focused on diplomacy, but she's going to probably bring, I think, a sort of I want to say like an all government approach, looking at all aspects of it, deferring to our expert diplomats, because at the end of the day, you need that. And I want to say I'm comforted to see one of the key State Department officials, Roberta Jacobson. She's kind of like the point person in the National Security Council. She was most recently the ambassador to Mexico for Obama, but a long career civil servant. She understands the issue, and she's made some articulate, explanations of it. She's the person right now going down there trying to negotiate with them. Again, no easy answers, but that's part of what it takes. You've got to go. You can't solve this just from over here. You need to engage the people themselves, the leaders, and the civil society groups. So it's not just a question of giving more money to the government of X or Y. It's dealing with civil society groups and say, okay, what can we do to help address this? And but again, it's all comprehensive. You need law enforcement has to be part of it. You need judicial reform that's going to help, bring order. And none of this is going to happen overnight. But what do? We can't give up.
We got to pay attention. We got to put leadership in, at the top. We're out of time, Carlos. I'm sorry. You've been watching Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. Today we've been discussing why do Central Americans emigrate with Carlos Juarez, who is our co-host and contributor here. We really appreciate your time, Carlos. We look forward to the next show soon enough. I'm Jay Fidell. Aloha, Carlos.